Good morning. We are thrilled to have this live training here for you about depreciation within the Taxware systems programs. We have Scott Dalton, enrolled agent and president of Taxware Systems, as the speaker today. He is the driver of our organization's technology solutions, and we support tax professionals like you across the United States. He will be speaking today. He has led this company for over 25 years and has managed the design and development of testing. So we are thrilled to turn the time over to him to speak to us today about depreciation.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, and we also have Mike Neilson on the chat window, so feel free to chat any questions that you might have, and Mike should be able to jump on those. Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking some time to get to know our depreciation systems a little bit better. I understand that depreciation can be a little bit intimidating. So in this webinar, I want to start with and focus on the simple and then build up to the more complex. So to keep things simple to start, I'm going to assume that we're all just using the defaults that come as part of the programs. And if you're doing so with some fairly straightforward depreciation, this simple tutorial might be most of what you need to understand about using depreciation in our systems. Okay, so to start, okay, so let's start with a simple but fairly typical example. Let's say I have a returning client and they have just started a brand new painting business. Of course, we ask some of the normal income expense questions, and this client is awesome. He has everything nice on a nice income and expense report, because that happens all the time to make our lives a lot easier, right? Now is when we start to probe into what some of the capital assets this business might have. And in that discussion, they let me know that they have a truck that is used for 80% business use. They have an office in the home that they just purchased a desk and computer and a printer, and they bought a new paint sprayer and some ladders and some other equipment. Of course, they'd have a lot of other items, but you get the general idea in our little example here. They have things set up as a single member LLC. So let's go ahead and dive into the program. And we're on the 1040 side, and we will access a Schedule C that I have already set up, but I haven't done the depreciation work on. We've started keying in some just generic income and expense items, but now we need to go ahead and set up his assets for the first time. And to do that, we're just going to access depreciation here with our button up at the top in the toolbar. And this will bring up the depreciation program. Because I haven't set anything up for Anthony's painting yet, we need to go ahead and do that by selecting New Client. And we'll just talk briefly about the client IDs for new clients, in that they're a little bit different than the way we set up our numeric client IDs in the 1040 or the entity programs. They can, of course, be numbers if you'd like, but I usually recommend people put things that are a little bit more descriptive. So for this client, we're going to say Tony Paint. And then it's going to bring us to our basic information page. Most of this is completely optional. It really is just, what do you want to display at the top of your various reports, your asset listings and whatnot. So we're going to put Tony. And an ID number. I like to put ID numbers so that they show on my asset listing, so I can definitely tie that particular asset listing to the 1040 return or whatever it might be. So we're going to put in Tony's ID. And the schedule description is just another line at the top of the headers. I'm going to leave that blank. And then you just have to tell it, what program am I interfacing with? So we're going to say, yes.
I have a, let's see. Is everybody, if everybody can respond in the question and answer, are you seeing Scott Dalton's screen? Just want to make sure. I had somebody mention that they are not able to see your screen. So I just want to make sure. Yep, they can see it. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Sorry for the interruption.
Good. No, we want to make sure it's working. Otherwise, not getting what we need to out of the webinar. Okay, so we just select what we're interfacing with, and then we're pretty much done with the basic information. And now that this is set up, it will be linked to Anthony's tax return, and we don't really need to go in here. It'll take us directly to Anthony's painting main screen. So to continue with our little demo, we need to add some assets now. The first time you set things up, it's going to talk to you about asset numbering. For the most part, unless you're doing departmental reports, you can skip this and just let it auto increment. But the first time you go in, it'll talk about how you can have between 1 and 99 different departments. But I'm going to say thank you. I don't need to see that again. And it's going to take us to our asset wizard with asset number 1. And so let's key in that truck. We're going to say it's a Ford F-250 painting truck. And Anthony got it for, let's say, $50,000, and he bought it this year. And then I think most of us know that your cars and trucks are going to be 5-year makers, but let's pretend you didn't know. You can use this lookup option, and right off the bat, you can see car. You can search for light duty truck. And then once you find the category, you can just double click that and you'll see that it's 5-year makers. So we're happy with that. We click OK. The next thing the program needs to know is, what does this specifically apply to? What schedule does this apply to? So we know that this is Anthony's Schedule C number 1. So we click in a number 1 and we click OK. And it'll bring us to our overall asset page where we can see our calculated depreciation, our cost, our basis, and just kind of give you an overall synopsis of what we just entered into the wizard. Now, Anthony let me know that this was 80% business use, so we're going to have some listed property. So we're going to go ahead and select listed property, and then we need to enter that it's 80% business use. In most of our programs, 1040 entities, we want you to enter percentages as decimal values, just like in our description here. So to enter 80%, I'm going to enter 0.8. And then as soon as I do, you'll see that my basis has automatically been reflected to include that. Now, Anthony said, I made a lot of money. Is there anything that we can do to increase our expenses? And, you know, we give the standard, well, they kind of are what they are, but for this capital asset, we could take some Section 179, but we don't want to go too crazy because we've got listed property maxes. So we're going to put in $5,000 of 179 for this year. And we are done with Anthony's truck. So let's key in some more assets. What else did I say? Oh, we've got an office desk, and we'll say it costs, I don't know, $1,250, required this year as well. Automatically calculates the recovery period based on your date of acquisition. And office furniture is 7-year makers, but let's again pretend we didn't know that. We can just start typing a like search and it will show 7-year makers. And again, we need to say, where is it going? Schedule C number 1. And go to the next item. And he had a computer. Usually get a little more descriptive than that, but I think we get the idea. I got the computer, 1,500 this year. Computers. And Schedule C number 1. That all looks fine. And let's do one more. I think we said HV laser jet. 50, it's an expensive printer. It's going to be computers as well. And Schedule C number 1. We had some other assets in our scenario, but I think you guys get the general idea that just keying in quick assets is pretty easy to do. The overall things are you need to make sure that it's going to the right schedule. Usually when I'm in there, I'll take a quick look at the reports. We will touch on the reports when we get into that section. But for now, I always just kind of like to take a quick look. It'll ask me how many, what assets I want to appear in the report. 9 times out of 10, that's all of them. So I just hit enter. And I just like to take a quick look at my numbers before I go back to the 1040 side to kind of look, okay, we've got these two combined should show up on my Schedule C. So we're done adding Tony's paint assets. So we're just going to click OK. And it's going to ask if I want to create a 4562, which I do. Just double checking the business income loss limitations. It's fine. And now we'll come down and we'll see our depreciation value is sitting on that Schedule C, but also a 4562 has been created. And then generally when I'm in depreciation, I'll go ahead and print my asset listing just to keep on file. But we do have the ability in the program that I'll show you later where you can print your asset listings from the form print in the 1040 program. So we are done with Tony's Schedule C. So let's build on that scenario just a little bit more. So during the interview, Tony let us know that he just purchased a home that he plans on, it's a rental, and what do we need to do to set that up? And of course, he's still awesome. So he provided me a nice income and loss statement with expense sheets for his rental. But the same things apply. What are the capital assets that are going to apply to this rental? So we need to do some depreciation work. So we will access depreciation. And now that I've already got Tony set up, like I said, it's going to just take me directly to Tony's page. There's no basic information that I need to set up in addition to that. But this is a rental, so we need to add some more assets. For rentals, I usually like to include a little bit more information as far as where it is. So we'll say street, and he bought it for $300,000, and he bought it this year. For rentals, there's really, or residential rentals, there's really only one category. It's 27.5 year. You can use the lookup, but you learn that pretty quick. And so this time, instead of going to Schedule C, obviously we're going to Tony's Schedule E, his first rental, and entering that as a number 1. And we're done with that. Then the next thing I like to do, it's kind of optional, but to keep track of things, I like to also include the land as a non-depreciable asset. Can't type. Oh, yeah, and on my houses, I usually like to include things like structure. So we'll go in and change that real quick. Here's land. Sometimes you can even include non-depreciable right in the description. Purely up to you. Through the different documents, we've determined that we'll say $50,000 of that is attributed to land, and of course it was purchased at the same time. This time it's going to be a little bit different in that there's not like a lookup, so we're going to go directly to the category, and we're going to select non-depreciable asset, because land is not a depreciable asset, and it'll ask for the life. Doesn't totally matter because it's non-depreciable, but I link those two. And of course, it's going to Schedule E number 1. Now for rental, you'd have all sorts of additional assets. You know, you may have lawnmowers, you may have, you know, all sorts of things, outbuildings and whatnot. But in general, you get the overall idea. Do want to change this structure so it makes a little bit more sense. Yeah, and then the report that I actually prefer to use, especially if I have multiple schedules applying to one depreciable client. The asset listing's great report, but I actually prefer this listing by tax code. Gives you the same exact information, but now it's broken out into subcategories. So we have Tony's Schedule C here with its subtotals, and then we have Tony's Schedule E with its subtotals, and then total depreciation that we'd expect to see across the board applied to our 4562s. So that's a handy report. I use that one a lot. So I think that is the basics of depreciation. And again, I just wanted to start with the simple, and then we can kind of move into the depreciation module itself and get a little bit more complex. Of course, we came out of depreciation, and now we see our depreciation value reported right there on the Schedule E. Okay, so just to recap a little bit. Okay, so if you're doing straightforward depreciation, it can be as simple as that. The basics, or to just kind of recap, you're going to enter or adjust client information for that client. You're going to record data for each of those assets. You're going to print the overall reports that you need, and then you're going to exit the depreciation. And with that program link, it's going to bring all that information forward into the applicable tax program. Now, the nice thing about depreciation is once you're finished with that, let's say Tony didn't buy or sell any new assets, dispose of any new assets for the next year. Once that's set up, you don't have to do anything. When you recall Tony as a prior year client, the program's going to automatically do what's called the year-end update and basically adjust the recovery year for that client's assets by 1 and adjust the totals that'll automatically reflect on the Schedule C and the Schedule E in this case, and have that information sitting there. And you don't even have to go into the assets management system at all. The 4562 is a pretty good form in encapsulating a summary of everything that's going on, but I still recommend going in and printing out your asset listing and keeping it on file. If we're paperless, which I am, I just tell it it's going to be a PDF and keep it in Tony's electronic file. But that's purely optional. Okay, so that kind of ends our simple tutorial. Now we're going to go through some more of the aspects of the program and dive into some of the features of our assets management system. Due to time constraints, I'll hit on a few of the items we get questions about, but we do have a pretty good detailed video that we created a few years ago in our Taxware videos page, and it goes into some pretty good detail. So don't feel like you need to memorize everything that we're covering right here in this webinar. There's a video that you can use for reference as well as the manual itself. The depreciation program can be accessed from, of course, the 1040. I kind of showed you in the individual schedules. It can also be accessed on the, we'll just go over there real quick. Can be accessed off the line input, can be accessed off the forms and schedules input. It can be accessed off of the Schedule C, E, F, and 4835. And then for the entity programs, in the deductions where depreciation falls is where you would access depreciation for your 1120, 1120Ss and 1065s. All right. Oh, and of course it can be accessed directly just from either making a desktop icon or from the Master Tax menu. Let's go ahead and I'm going to swap these here. Okay, so let's talk about depreciation a little bit more. First, we've hit on the first one. There's kind of two modes to depreciation. The first and the most commonly used is the income tax integration. This is where you're using depreciation as a direct part of the data entry process, just like we showed you doing with Anthony's paint. The other mode is the standalone mode, which is what I have up on the screen. If you're using the income tax integration, except for starting a new client, you'd never really see this screen because you really don't need it. But we do have a few clients that use it as standalone. And also we have a few clients that know they're going to be doing some extensive depreciation work and they want to get that done before they have their meeting with their client. So they just access depreciation directly and key in their assets, mark things as disposed and so on. So we're just going to start and kind of go through depreciation as if it was a standalone, but knowing that we mainly access it through the integration process. So the buttons are pretty obvious. The new client we've already touched on. Again, we would just encourage you to probably use unique client IDs that make sense for that client. You can't write a book for a description. I would keep it, 10 characters or less. But instead of using numeric values, I would write a descriptor about that particular client. Recalling client and prior year client works pretty much the same way as the 1040 system. Got your basic grid, you search for your clients and find the applicable clients and work with them. We do require with the new next gen program that it uses a prior and current year data path, because as part of that prior year recall, whether it's done in here or as part of the integration with, say, the 1040 system, it will do that year-end update process. I'll refer to year-end update a handful of times throughout this webinar, but just know in general, that's more of a grandfathered mindset from the old depreciation. If you're current on your depreciation, you don't need to click the year-end update button really ever. The only time you'd need to click it is if you had a client that maybe came back to you and you had their depreciation data, but it was like over a year old and you basically needed to catch them up, then we do have a year-end update button that you can click to basically catch them up. Configuration page is pretty much self-explanatory. The only thing that I'll point out is the department title database. If you are using departments, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, this is where you can key in your department titles, and that just prints at the top of your departmental listings, whether those are transactional or some of your year-end summaries. The other thing I'll point out, of course, we encourage you to make backups, get your backups on a scheduler, just like with 1040 and the other systems. And then the depreciation carry information has more to do with how do you want the information to flow to the 1040 system. You can access this right within the client. So if you don't hit it here, not that big of a deal. But basically, if you have disposed assets, do you want that information to carry forward automatically 4797? Or we have some clients that prefer to just use the disposition report and then key that information as applicable. So that's an option. And then the other option is consolidated 4562s. Purely optional. If you want all of the information to consolidate. So for like Anthony, he had a Schedule C and a Schedule E. If you want those to consolidate to one 4562, you can select this box. If you like his Schedule C to be on basically its own 4562 and his Schedule E to be in its 4562, then you leave that unchecked for the 1040 carries. Okay, let's go to, let's access our main menu. So let's go find Tony's paint. We'll use him again. Let's see. I accessed the wrong client, didn't I? There it is. Tony starts with a T, not an A. I had Anthony in my brain, so I was looking up by Anthony. Okay, so here we'll use Tony's paint and we'll just kind of go over some of these screens. The basic information screen we pretty much covered. The assets, add assets page will of course open our wizard, change assets page. We're going to get into these things in a little bit more detail. So let's just go into our basic information page. Just to add a couple more items, for the most part out of the box, it's very simple, but you do have some preference items that you might want to select. One is this automatic switch to straight line. This automatically switches to straight line based on the life of the asset when depreciation becomes a little bit better. Those are built in pretty strong to the makers tables already. So if you're using a standard category, probably don't need to do that, but it's not going to hurt. And then the other option that gets used quite a bit is, does state items equal federal? So in Anthony's scenario, you'll notice that I was constantly filling in federal items. And it would allow me to adjust or key in the state items as well had I selected that. Or if you hit state equals fed, it will auto-fill the state amounts with the federal amounts. And then your section 179 limits, we took 5,000 of 179. So you'll see the available 179 limit get decremented throughout the year per client. And then of course, you'll see the federal maxes get reset at the beginning of each year. Let's see. Yeah, we've kind of covered that, but I will show you, I don't have the best sample with Tony here, so you'll have to use your imagination. But let's say you had a large depreciation schedule. This client has, I don't know, let's say 10 Schedule E's, handful of Schedule C's. He's got, a couple hundred, 500 assets in this grid. And you need to be able to sort kind of, okay, where are his assets? I want to narrow this list down. So you'll have to pretend a little bit that we've got, I don't know, 500 assets sitting in a grid here. And we want to work with a specific subset to kind of see what's what. So we have filters. The first is the major tax code, and then it's a specific tax code. So in the major tax code, the system automatically senses and goes, okay, this person has Schedule C's and Schedule E's. So to start, let's say I just want to look at Schedule C's. So as soon as I click this, you'll see the Schedule E's disappear. And then the specific tax code, and this is where my example is not super great. Pretend you had, I don't know, 5 Schedule C's, but the information that you want to work with only has to do with Schedule C number 1. So the tax carry code you can see here is Schedule C number 1. You could further filter that by hitting Schedule C number 1, and then instead of seeing like 5 Schedule C's worth of information, you would only see Schedule C number 1's information. So hopefully we can use our imagination and that made sense to you. The next menu is the assets page itself. So let's use our office desk here. So we've kind of talked about these things in our tutorial, but just briefly go over the asset number. Just auto increments isn't, it's just kind of a reference number. The date of acquisition is pretty important. Make sure that's correct. If by accident you keyed in the wrong date on the wizard, you can go ahead and correct that here. And then the recovery year, the best way to think about that is if you've been in the IRS instructions and you've seen the tables for 7-year makers in this case, you'll see the columns and the rows have to do with the year. So you can think of this as what column and what row is this looking up in the table for that particular, in this case, 7-year makers group. So this will automatically get advanced during that prior year recall process or year-end update process. So you really don't need to play with this at all, but just have a base understanding of where it's calculating your overall depreciation has to do with where it is in the table. Your tax codes we've covered. Your cost, let's see, I think that's really all there is to show you there. Just checking my notes real quick. Oh, yes, so 2 more items. If this was an alternate method, and even in the wizard, if you do select an alternate method, let's say it's, well, straight line, the program will ask you what's the life of this? Because we don't know. You haven't selected a standard category. So it's going to ask you the life of that particular asset and calculate it based on that. And it'll also make things visible dealing with alternate lives. But for now, I'm going to switch that back so I can show you one more thing. And that's up at the top. We have this duplicate this asset. And what the duplicate this asset does is it just helps speed things along. If you're setting up a bunch of assets and the client was nice enough to bring you things basically in categories. So let's say this was a rental and you had, I don't know, you wanted to start tracking a bunch of appliances or whatnot. It can speed things up by hitting the duplicate asset. So I'm going to click that and you'll see my asset number is going to switch from 2 to the next greatest in the available list. So I'm going to hit duplicate asset. Yes, I am. And finish with that. That's good. And you'll see now this is a completely new asset. And that's where I like to be a little bit more descriptive on some of my information. You could put something like Anthony's desk or something. I don't know. Maybe it's his wife's desk. But you can get a little bit more descriptive. And this is a completely separate asset. But you don't have to type the basic type that it is or the method that it is, the overall life and those things and where it goes. All you need to really be concerned with is what is it and how much did it cost? So let's say this desk was $1,050 instead of $1,250. We can quickly swap things out and now we're done with that asset. And along with that, I'm getting out of order, but let's go ahead and just for fun, talk about departments a little bit. So this isn't the best example, but let's say we wanted a specific department dealing with furniture. And we wanted that first department to be department number 1. So we're going to use the decimal value of 0.01 for that department. And we're going to do the same for this one. So now both of these office desks are tied to department number 1. And to kind of show you what that looks like, get rid of that, and let's go to a departmental listing, and we're going to preview that report. Sure, can't type today, but you get the idea. So now in Tony's paint, we have the non-departmentalized assets, but now we also have an additional subdivision of this particular department specified by department number 1, so that you can kind of categorize things a little bit further. All right. Oh, let's go back. I forgot to show the other button. So the other thing that I'll talk about is just this auto calc prior depreciation. We get a question on this from time to time, and this is a situation where you've got either a brand new client or returning client, and they have capital assets, but maybe they've had a falling out with their tax professional or what have you, but they don't have access to their prior year depreciation information. Of course, if you have prior year depreciation and you're keying in old assets, the best way to do it is use the information that's actually been provided, because that was the real depreciation that was taken over the life of that asset. But short of that, if you just can't get that information, you can click this auto calc prior depreciation. And what that'll do, let's I don't know, let's switch this to recovery year 3. And what that'll do is the system will basically take its best guess, hoping that the prior year depreciation was using pretty much standard tables. And in this case, it'll say, all right, well, we assume that for 7 years makers, if they've already taken some depreciation, we can click this, and using those tables, it'll auto-populate its best guess as to what it thinks depreciation should have been taken. So again, that's just an option that if you don't have the actual real data, you can kind of back into those numbers by selecting that option. Okay, let's dive into some other info. So our depreciation system can handle some simple depreciation like we've shown you, but it also will handle a lot of complex issues, ranging from things from book depreciation, salvage, and preference. I'm not going to dive into those because they just don't apply that much unless you're doing financial work and you want to actually work with that finance and go, okay, what's our projected salvage going to be? And our video touches on that a little bit more. Or what's going to be the difference between our preference with our alternative minimum taxes and in some of those things. So these are more edge case. So I'm not going to dive into those too much, but I will touch on a couple things. First, in this screen is where if you have a disposed asset, this is where you'd put it. And if that asset's been disposed, it's going to look for a disposition date and a disposition price. So let's say Tony sold this desk, or it assumes that he sold the whole business, but we're going to put in a disposition date. And as soon as I hit enter, the program's going to ask me if I want to apply this disposition date to all of the assets with Schedule C number 1 in this case. Generally, you'd say yes to that. And it just kind of asks and makes sure. And so now it's applied a disposition date to all of the assets. It hasn't entered a disposition price for all of the assets, but it keys it up and gets you ready and saves you a little bit of time so that you can enter the disposition price, and then you can either display the disposition report back on a reports page and have that information available to key in, or this also flags the system if you've selected to carry disposed of assets to the 4797, that's the flag to let the system know, okay, we've got some 4797 work to do. And then during prior year recall or / year-end update, the program will remove any assets that had a disposition date for that particular year.
Hey, Scott.
Yep.
Can I jump in and just make sure we clarify that when you say yes to that you want to apply that disposition date to all of the assets, that's in the case that you're selling the whole business.
Right.
You've sold the whole Schedule C, the whole business. Or if you're on a rental property, you've sold the whole rental property. But if you're just selling a piece of equipment as part of the business, then you definitely want to say no to that because you're only selling the one item. And that's just a tool to make it easy to sell the whole business all in one shot without having to do that. And a good example on the rental property is that you never have an individual price for the whole thing, but you sell the rental property along with all the assets that went along with it, air conditioners or whatever was in that. So anyway, I just want to make sure that we clarified that, because so I don't know that you had mentioned that we normally want to say yes to that, but definitely pay attention to that question.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for clarifying that. Yeah, and just to kind of go along with that, if you accidentally key this in, like, no, I didn't mean to say yes to that for all the assets, you can just clear that date out and it'll ask you the same thing. And then basically all of those that I had accidentally, in Mike's scenario, keyed as a disposition date, now those are all cleared for that same asset. And now I can go in and say, oh, you know what? I just sold this one and it was sold on this date. No, I would not like to apply that because it was just this desk that I sold. And now we're dealing with just this one particular asset. So yes, thank you, Michael. The last thing I'll touch on here is just exchange codes. If you want to link assets together for reporting basis, anything with the exchange code, just arbitrary, will show up on the exchange code report. It's just a way to further link or have your reports show those items. All right, for now we are going to get rid of that. Did it to the one. Let's see, do I want to talk about short year data now, or I think I'll talk about it as we come up on it in the screen. Okay, let's go to, well, I mentioned it. Let's go ahead and talk about short year data. Short year data, or the short year calculation, isn't used too often. Of course, it only applies to a tax year that is less than 12 months. So we're not generally talking about 1040 returns. An example would be Terra Corporation switch from basically a fiscal year to calendar year, and that switch only applied for like 10 months. That's when you would have a short year calculation. Now, there are two short year calculations, or two options. This option is basically to work with your entire asset base for this particular client. The other short year option is on an individual asset by asset basis, which is what I was showing on this other info screen. So generally, well, I hate to use words like generally, but sometimes when you're clicking or setting up a short year, it would apply to all the assets that would take into effect this particular client. But each asset obviously has its own date of acquisition date. So I'm not going to get too far into the weeds. Again, you can watch our video or watch our or read the help manual. But generally, you'll run the short calculation on all of this client's assets, and it's going to ask you the months and whatnot. And then you can go in and change the individual assets to the correct month as it would apply on this specific short year data page. So again, I don't want to go too far into that. It's kind of edge case stuff when you're switching generally from fiscal to a tax or a calendar year, but that's what that option does. Okay, let's back up and talk about reports just a little bit. We've touched on a lot of the reports, and for the most part, they're self-explanatory, but I do want to touch on a couple reports. One is the projected by tax code and projected departmental. And what this does is this is a scenario where your client comes to you and they basically want some tax planning. They can say, hey, our overall asset group is going to look pretty similar next year. What are we looking at for overall deductions for next year? And when you select this, what it in essence does is it basically tells the system, hey, advance all these assets by 1 year as far as a recovery year table, and then show me the numbers that are gonna apply to this client. One thing it cannot do completely accurately is listed property, because we generally don't know those rates until they get published. So just be aware that that may not be spot on because it's using the listed property rates and maxes from the current year. But everything else, it will basically advance that by 1 year and show you what your actual depreciation will be for that client. So that's a really awesome report, kind of handy to have in the toolbox for sure. And I think we've kind of touched on most of the other things. You can print a 4562 directly from the assets management system, but for the most part, at least I always just print it from the 1040 or the 1120 or whatever that program might be. Yeah. Let's go into miscellaneous options and we'll come back to mid-quarter computations. Well, no, while we're talking about reports, sorry, bouncing all over a little bit. When you're doing the mid-quarter computation, we recommend that you actually produce the mid-quarter computation worksheet report. And that just shows you, basically it shows you, do I need to do mid-quarter computation? In essence, did 40% or more of my assets get purchased this year during the fourth quarter? So this mid-quarter computation worksheet is real handy. All of my assets were purchased before the fourth quarter, so it does not apply, and that's why it's showing 0 here. But this is a handy report to have. So we recommend that you just take a quick look at that, and then your mid-quarter computation is going to pretty much run automatic. Based on your selections on the overall worksheet. You can undo the mid-quarter computation by restoring your fed values. Otherwise, it's going to loop through and basically apply the mid-quarter computations to the assets that applies for that first year. And then in addition to that, on our reports for those assets moving forward, you'll see a couple things, and they're kind of in the legend here. You'll see a Q as well as a D if you had disposed. And if we had applied the mid-quarter computation off to the right, you'll see a Q. Like, let's pretend, you know, for this year, that applied, these would have Q next to them, so that in subsequent years, as you're working with the life of this particular client, obviously you're going to have some assets that had mid-quarter computation applied and some that didn't, but you can kind of stand out which ones had mid-quarter calculations applied to them as they display in the overall reports. All right, let's go into a few of our miscellaneous options. I know I'm running a little bit low on time. So we've already talked about what these options do as far as carrying forward to the 1040. The things to touch on here in the miscellaneous options are just the resequencing. Basically, this option is going to ask you to input a carry code of the item that's been disposed or deleted as it's been entered, and go through the assets and reduce that carry code of any assets that fall within that code group by 1. That probably didn't make sense to anyone, so I'll share a quick example. Would be if, let's say they had a bunch of rentals and they sold their 3rd rental. The assets of that rental would be disposed, and then during the year-end update, they wouldn't be included. That 3rd rental is gone. So this client has, let's say they had 5, but now they only have 4 rentals. You can resequence, and you would enter code 103 or the 3rd rental as the old one, and then the program would go through all the assets and reset the tax codes of the rental assets by 1 lower. It's kind of hard to explain in words, but that's what that does in essence. And the manual reassign just allows you to manually do the same process, but instead of doing it automatically, decrementing by 1, you can just tell it 1 for 1. I want this rental to now be called this rental, or Schedule C, or whatever it might be. All right. Let's see. And the mid-quarter computations we pretty much covered. So just to recap a few main points. Oh, you know what? I did think of one thing. I did want to touch briefly on, I need to switch this back. Okay, so when you're setting up an asset, I will just kind of touch on half-year convention. So if you have determined that this is applicable for half-year convention rules, during a recovery year 1 asset, in essence, instead of doing on the initial year, the calculation basically is what's my basis, divide that by the life of the asset, and that's your depreciation, except for the first and the last year. In the first year, if it's not half-year convention rules, then that's going to basically be prorated by the day. How many days was this asset calculated for that first year? For half-year convention rules, basically it just cuts it in half, as well as it goes in, as well as it's coming out on its last year. So I just did want to make you aware of where you would set the half-year convention rules, because that is pretty common. Let's see, just going over my notes here. Just to recap, short year calculation, just isn't used that often. To delete an asset, it's the same as the 1040. You just highlight it and then click the delete button, and you delete assets. And then just for people that are familiar with our old assets management system, the new assets management system definitely requires that you use a current year data folder and a prior year data folder. And again, once that's set up, you never see this menu again. It'll handle all the year-end updates. I think that is kind of what I wanted to cover. I know I'm out of time. Michael, am I forgetting anything? Were there any questions that came up?
No, I think that I don't see any open answers, open questions. But I don't, yeah, I think that I can't think of anything else that you haven't covered. Maybe just go over, oh no, I think you covered that too. Never mind. Sorry.
Oops. Well, I think that's it. Again, thanks everyone for learning a little bit more about depreciation. Again, we have a lot of references, especially that longer video that's available on our webpage, as well as the help manual. So don't feel like you need to learn everything just in one webinar. I believe Catherine recorded this webinar also, so I assume they're going to make that available somewhere on our videos page. So don't stress out if you didn't learn everything about depreciation in one sitting. There is a lot to depreciation, and it can get fairly complicated if you're working with some large clients, but at its core, it's pretty simple. You know, you're keying in assets, you're getting them into the right program group, and you're letting that flow through to the correct forms or schedules. So with that, I think that's it. Catherine, do I turn it back over to you, or do we just shut her down here?
Great job. Thank you. Thank you for everything you've shared today, and I will close out the webinar. If you have any other questions that were not answered during this time, feel free to send us a message in support@taxwaresystems.com or give us a call at 800-877-1065. Thank you. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.